Welcome to today's lecture on the Peel family at Marble Hill. It is a real delight to have you here and to be celebrating a residency at Marble Hill that was longer than Henrietta Howard, who is obviously our acclaimed Lady of Marble Hill, and it is indeed her legacy that we are celebrating as part of a lot of the project. But it's lovely to be able to talk about some of the more recent history. The Peel family had a long residency at Marble Hill, and we are very lucky to have the stables as part of their legacy. And I know that she'll be talking a little bit more about that. But the cafe has been an important part of the Marble Hill Revived project. And that's indeed why we're here this evening. The Marble Hill Revived project has enabled us through a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund of £5 million and £3 million from English Heritage, the charity itself, to be able to help invest in Marble Hill, to be able to make sure that the house is safeguarded for future generations by investing in its infrastructure and making sure that the damp is sorted and the roof doesn't leak. And we can't wait to open in spring for free, 5 days a week. The cafe, as I mentioned, is an important part of the project. You can go and have a lovely cup of coffee and know that you're giving back to the charity with every sip. We're also investing in our sports facilities and to make them much better for our community. And that's everything from the football pitches to the tennis courts and indeed our changing facility, which is being made available for both men and women, and it's being made available to be accessible by all. And also we're doing a number of different events, and this of course is one of them. So it's lovely to be able to welcome you to share about our history, but also to welcome some of the amazing people who've been part of the project. And we include Leonie as part of that. Leonie is our speaker this evening, and you may have seen her in a presentation that she gave with Thomas Cromwell from Historic England about archaeology, where she was involved in learning about the shells and the shell trade, and she shared very generously about that research. But she's also been working with the team to be able to explore the Peel family a little bit more. Her PhD is a study of the 17th and 18th century family life, and she's doing that in Sheffield. It's going to be a great opportunity to see some of her interpretation come to life as she has been involved in creating some of the work that will be visible when we open in spring. So it is with great delight that I get the opportunity to invite Leonie to the floor to be able to share about the history that she has been working on. And thank you so much for being with us this evening. Leonie.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So hello, everyone. I'm Leonie, and I'm a PhD researcher in the history department at the University of Sheffield. So in the summer and autumn of 2021, I undertook a 3-month research placement with English Heritage based at Marble Hill House. So Rachel's mentioned just in her intro that I looked at the grotto, and that was in the second half of my placement. But the research I'll be talking about today is a little dive into what I uncovered in the first 6 weeks of my placement, during which time I was looking at the Peels, who lived at Marble Hill for over 60 years in the 19th century. I looked at all the surviving letters the Peels left behind, which were a really wonderful and detailed bunch of resources, and they're mainly from the 1850s. We only have Jonathan's writing. Unfortunately, very little of Alice's own voice survives, but the letters are mainly those that Jonathan sent to her when they were apart. And they're really great, even though Alice's voice isn't there, because we can still see like Jonathan's perspective of life at Marble Hill, telling Alice, who's usually away in France, about what's going on at the house. Or we get snapshots of Alice's life there through the lines as Jonathan responds to her news from her at the house. Okay, so for anyone who isn't completely familiar with the site or who hasn't visited in person, Marble Hill is located within the Twickenham area of southwest London here. When the Peels were living at the house, it fell within the county of Middlesex, rather than being formally recognised as part of London, as it is today. Marble Hill was built by Henrietta Howard, Countess of Suffolk, in the 1720s, and Rachel mentioned her in her intro. There she is there. Positioned along the river, the house was part of a neighbourhood of Georgian villas, which in the 18th century were inhabited and frequented by artists and writers like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, and many prominent figures associated with the Georgian social elite like Horace Walpole. The area offered an idyllic retreat from the bustle of inner London and the Georgian royal court, and its beautiful surroundings were recreated over and over again in the many paintings and engravings made of this stretch of river during the period. Marble Hill had never felt very distant from London, but by the 19th century, the house was within much closer reach. The first station was built at nearby Richmond in the 1840s, allowing passengers to move much more freely between the quieter, calmer Twickenham area and the commotion of the city. As I'll touch on later, this was key for the Peels, whose time at Marble Hill spanned a period of huge social change. Politician Jonathan Peel married Alice, or Alicia Jane Kennedy, in March 1824. Now, it's important to note that both Alice and Alicia appear in reference to Alice throughout her life, but for the purposes of brevity and simplicity, as I just mentioned there, I called her Alice. Yeah, I'm going to be calling her Alice throughout the rest of the talk. Just over a year after their marriage, the couple purchased the house at Marble Hill in 1825. They remained at the property for the rest of their married lives. Jonathan died at the house in 1879, and Alice continued to inhabit it as a widow thereafter, up until her own death in 1887. Alice had pre-existing attachments to the area. She was born in Scotland in 1805, the youngest daughter of Sir Archibald Kennedy III and his wife Margaret. In 1815, her father purchased a property a little further upriver, in addition to the family's main estates in Ayrshire. They bought a second house next door a few years later as well, actually, and demolished the original and rebuilt a house on its plot that became known as St Margaret's, and that gives its name to the area there. You can see it's just to the left of that map, St Margaret's. That's the name used for the whole area. The family were well established by the time of their eldest daughter's wedding in 1821, which took place at St Margaret's House itself. So they would definitely have been comfortably secured in the area by the time Alice and her new husband Jonathan moved in nearby in 1825. Over the course of this talk, I'm going to look at each of the different family members, employees and animals that lived at Marble Hill under the ownership of the Peels. I'm going to start with Jonathan and Alice themselves, then look in turn at their children, members of their household and park staff, and some of the animals that called the house and its grounds home. So I'm going to start with Jonathan Peel, whose relations are the key reason the surname Peel carries any weight when we think of it. Jonathan Peel was born in 1799, and he was the fifth son of Sir Robert Peel, 1st Baronet. Sir Robert Peel's 2nd Baronet, who was Jonathan's older brother, is the Robert Peel who served as Prime Minister, once in the 1830s and again in the 1840s. Like his older brother, Jonathan was involved in politics. He was MP for Norwich in his earlier career and subsequently MP for Huntingdon, whom he represented until his retirement in 1868. He also held those 2 other offices that are under his name on screen. You can see Jonathan here in the House of Commons in 1860, in the top hat on the right. He sat opposite Liberal Prime Minister Palmerston, alongside the other Conservatives. To his left, our right, is the Earl of Derby, son of the previous Prime Minister who had appointed Jonathan to the War Office, and next to him is Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli appears numerous times in Jonathan's letters and was a close friend, which in itself is a bit wild considering that Disraeli had been so troublesome for Jonathan's brother, Robert Peel, when he was Prime Minister. He opposed Peel's repealing of the Corn Laws and was, a vociferous opponent to him. We know Jonathan and Robert didn't completely see eye to eye either, and there are letters in the collection where Robert's really angry at his brother Jonathan for taking opposing views in Parliament, and he's writing to him, really begging him to change his mind. Jonathan was often away from Marble Hill on political and social visits for days at a time. Lots of his letters date from stays at Balmoral, which is in the photograph there. You can see Queen Victoria on the steps, when he was Secretary of State for War. He writes in lots of detail, discussing the Queen, Victoria, the royal family, and other prominent political figures. He often got up really early, did War Office work before breakfast and the first post, then spent the day walking, shooting, or horse riding with the other guests and the Queen herself. He'd have dinner in company, and he talks at length in his letters about all of the debates and the discussions he had, and they're really rich in a bit of spicy gossip as well. It's really good. And then he'd go and do more work late at night before going to bed. You can probably see from the letters that I've put on screen that his writing isn't the easiest to read, and that's made a bit more tricky by the fact that he says he's mostly writing them to Alice in snatches of time between work, sleep, and socialising. Victoria herself was very fond of Peel, and the 15 surviving letters sent to him by her attest to this. The one I've put on screen is in response to Peel's final resignation from Parliament in 1868. He was clearly a useful ally for her as well as a friend, as she requests that he refrain from resigning, offering him a position as MP in a safe seat should he choose to stay. When Peel fell ill in later life, he and Alice received multiple telegrams from the Queen, inquiring after him and sending her best wishes to them both, describing him as a friend and an excellent man. As I mentioned briefly at the start, the railway arrived within reach of Marble Hill in the 1840s. For Peel, who often needed to be in Parliament when it was in session, this put the House within commuting distance of London. Jonathan walked to nearby Richmond Station from home. You can see on the map it is walkable, although it is a fair trek now. We'd hop on the bus more likely nowadays. But Jonathan walked to nearby Richmond Station. He talks about train travel a lot in his letters and the encounters he made in the process. Trains would have been sociable spaces for many people making similar journeys in and out of the city. And on one occasion, Jonathan describes meeting a gentleman on the train who agreed with him that nobody really cares sixpence about reform. If you can make that out in his hand there, hopefully you can. As well as his walks to and from Richmond and Marble Hill, we get these really lovely descriptions of Jonathan walking through central London on his way to the Palace of Westminster and the War Office. The trains took passengers from Richmond to the same point they still do today, Waterloo Station, and Jonathan describes walking across Westminster Bridge on his route to the Houses of Parliament. The Peels had a second home in central London, near St James's Park, but for Jonathan, it was less crucial that he stay there for long periods, once that train travel meant he was able to move more freely between central London and Marble Hill. There's one incident that makes it clear just how crucial a concern transport was for him, though, and for everyone else involved in political terms. And I was really keen to show this one to you all. This event happened one evening in Parliament. The House was discussing a proposed bill that would relieve the Queen from signing so many commissions. Jonathan was well aware of how overworked Victoria felt, having spent time with her at Balmoral, and commented on the volume of letters and documents requiring authorisation that arrived for her at all hours of the day and night. Jonathan was in favour of the bill, but understood that an argument would need to be made in order to allow it to pass, as the Conservatives would almost certainly see it as a weakening of royal prerogative. Instead of offering to explain the bill himself and quieten these concerns, Jonathan urged others to make the case. One of his colleagues didn't feel it necessary, even though he'd received multiple letters requesting it and knew that everyone at Osborne House, which was Victoria's residence on the Isle of Wight, wished him to explain it. Jonathan described in his letter that he could not wait later than 11:30, as I must go by the last train. The bill was read in the end and no explanation was made, while Jonathan argued that he could not possibly help it, as I must have walked home or come in a cab if I had waited for it. He knew that the Queen and her advisers would be strongly disappointed and that the bill wouldn't pass, and that they would be pretty angry as well, actually, but he left anyway, not wanting to be too inconvenienced. And I absolutely love this, seeing how the fact that Jonathan, wanting to make sure he got the train home, had a really clear effect on national politics and on the experiences of the Queen. While Jonathan was occupied with governmental and ministerial politics, Alice had a political circle of her own. Alice's circle centred on British as well as international politics, and she was strongly enmeshed with contemporary French political movements, with a wealth of connections to French diplomatic and royal figures. The letters in Alice's collection reveal that she made repeated trips to Paris, where she sometimes stayed for significant periods of time. Many of the letters she received while there survive with their envelopes intact, so we can start to build a picture of where Alice was staying and the areas that she was frequenting while in the city. Alice's closest friend, with whom she spent a lot of her time in Paris, was Princess Dorothea Lieven. Now, if you haven't come across her before, she is a really interesting figure, and I would really recommend reading up on her afterwards. She was of noble German descent, and her mother was a lady in waiting to the Russian Romanov dynasty. She was married to the Russian ambassador to London, and she was close friends with many of the most prominent European statesmen, including George IV of England, Lord Palmerston, and Austrian diplomat Prince Metternich. Lieven was very politically active herself, and after leaving London and separating from her husband in 1835, she hosted one of the most popular intellectual salons in Paris, conducting herself as an independent stateswoman. This was Alice's closest friend and the circle in which Alice was moving in Paris. And the letters are really touching, actually. They show that the two women were often in each other's company and that they dropped in on one another at all hours of the day. Alongside Princess Lieven, Alice knew countless other individuals prominent in French politics, including Lieven's 20-year lover and partner, François Guizot, later Prime Minister of France. Alice exchanged over 100 letters with him. Alice was also friendly with another French Prime Minister, historian and later President Adolphe Thiers. Both Guizot and Thiers were members of the Orleanist faction, a group supporting the Orleans dynasty and their claims to French rule. In the wake of the July Revolution of 1830, Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, ruled as king until his abdication upon the February Revolution of 1848, which heralded the beginning of the Second Republic. The Orleans family fled France under these circumstances, and West London became a centre to which they all flocked. All of Louis-Philippe's sons, except one, settled in properties clustered fairly near to Marble Hill. Even Antoine, Duc de Montpensier, who settled in Spain, spent some time in London and indeed rented Marble Hill itself from Jonathan and Alice Peel in 1865. As I'm sure many of you will recognise from the name if you're local to the area, the house immediately next door to Marble Hill is in fact still called Orleans House today and was rented by Louis-Philippe himself during his earlier exile in the 1810s. So Marble Hill at this moment was right near the epicentre of the exiled French royal court, whom Alice knew and with whom she regularly corresponded. The sales catalogue made upon Alice's death shows her involvement with Orleanist political and social circles, showing, as you can see on screen, that Alice had numerous engraved portraits of individuals associated with the faction and the French royal family themselves. In the picture on the top right, where it says Duc de Nemours, Nemours should actually read Nemours, who was another son of King Louis-Philippe. Alice had political interests and ties independently of her husband. I'm returning to the picture I showed earlier, which in addition to Peel and his Conservative Party members, also features Liberal politician and author John Bright. He's there on the left. You'll see that Bright was on the opposite side of the bench to Peel, and Peel for the most part was not a fan. Bright and Alice exchanged correspondence for a couple of years, and one of Peel's letters to her describes him somewhat sardonically as your friend Bright. So it's really clear that Alice's relationship with Bright didn't come about through her husband. Bright's diaries reveal that he attended a luncheon at Marble Hill, hosted by Alice in Jonathan's absence, and that he also attended alongside Benjamin Disraeli, who I mentioned earlier, who was a later Prime Minister, and his wife, ministers from Saxony and Prussia, and attachés from the Prussian embassy in Paris. So it was a really international dinner reflecting Alice's international ties. Alice's letters to Bright show her discussing intelligence collected from her French friends, including Guizot and the Duc d'Orléans. Their correspondence occurred in the years running up to a key treaty that promoted closer links with France, the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which Bright was instrumental in championing. It seems that Alice was mobilising her ties both in France and in Britain to orchestrate desired political outcomes, promoting the interests of the circles within which she was moving. I love seeing that she's doing this independently of Jonathan as well. The letters with Bright are the only ones where we actually have any surviving evidence of Alice's own words, because the rest are just letters sent to her, but we do have her responses to Bright. So it's really cool that we have a bit of a hint of what she's up to here, and that even where her voice doesn't directly survive, we have so much evidence of who she was mixing with and the kind of ideas that she was sharing. Marble Hill would have been a hub for Alice's associates as much as for Jonathan's, and we have some fantastic evidence of people calling around among the letters. There are personal notes from people like the Duke of Wellington, who seems to have made fairly regular visits. There's a really great one actually where he was due to call in for tea, but unfortunately he fell off his horse and the horse ran off, so he had to walk home and couldn't make it in time for tea. There's another really beautiful little note that paints a really clear picture of Marble Hill as a house in use as well, a really lived in space. And that's a letter from Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, who was a granddaughter of King George III. The princess was a close friend of Jonathan and Alice Peel, and it's a very short letter showing that they were fairly informal with each other, just letting Alice know that I've written here that she'd like to drop by, but she kind of more says, I'm going to drop by in the afternoon for a game of croquet on the Marble Hill lawns. So yeah, it's all right for some, isn't it? That's lovely. Yeah. As well as a social hub for figures involved in British and European politics, Marble Hill was crucially also a family home. All 7 of the Peel children were raised here, 4 sons and 3 daughters, and remained living at the house for varying amounts of time. The 3 Peel daughters lived with their parents at Marble Hill until their respective marriages. And all 3 daughters were still living at Marble Hill during the main period covered by Jonathan's letters to his wife. So his writings give us some really candid insights into daily life at the house, involving all of the daughters. In one letter written by Jonathan to Alice while she was away in Paris, we can see Jonathan accompanying Adelaide Peel, the youngest of the Peel's daughters, on a visit to the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was built to house the Great Exhibition of 1851, a showcase of the finest exports and artworks from different countries all over the world. Jonathan and 2 of his daughters actually went to watch a bird show there, and his letters have some really lovely details about them, all only just managing to resist temptation and leave the exhibit without buying anything. Jonathan's talking about how beautiful the exotic birds were and how they were surprisingly cheap compared to other shops around London. And I love this image of them all, just about managing not to add even more animals to the ones they had at home, which I'll touch on later on. The Peel sons seem mostly to have left the family home. 3 of their sons, Archibald, Esmond and John, went on to join the army. One of their sons, William, or Willie, as he is often referred to in the letters, was at the house much more regularly, even into adulthood though. He crops up offering to meet his mother or father with their luggage when either of them return from a journey, as in the letter on screen. For the record as well, if you haven't seen this before, this is another thing that crops up alongside Jonathan's fiddly handwriting. And that's, so he writes the letter and then he turns it 90 degrees and he overwrites it again. Yeah, it's just a bit of a minefield for trying to decode everything, but it is just about legible, thankfully. Anyway, we see Willie making visits with Jonathan around London on errands as well as for pleasure. Whenever one of his parents was away, William was clearly writing to them as well. His writings don't actually survive, but we can see that he was doing so because his parents are then discussing the little bits of news that he was giving them in their own letters to each other. So if we just focus on narratives of politics and sociability, it can be quite easy to lose a sense of the real interactions that are taking place beneath the surface. But the Peels were in constant contact with their children, who were really central to life at Marble Hill. William seems to have come and gone a bit more from the house rather than actually living there permanently. But one daughter, Margaret, or Mag, as she was called, was always present. She was present. She was actually someone who we never knew lived long term at the house with her parents before looking at these letters. So she's a really incredible find and addition to the Marble Hill story. You can see her in one of the census returns there. That's towards the end of her life. She's with Alice Peel, who's 75, and Margaret Peel, you can see there, age 50. We can see from all of her appearances in the Marble Hill census that she never married, which is likely why she stayed living with her parents. She still had a life of her own, of course, but we can see her in her parents' letters making visits to London and further afield with friends, but she always came home. We get a real picture of her as a third key member of the household. In one letter, she's doing the books for her parents, presumably some sort of account keeping. She's involved in caring for both of her parents when either of them are ill. Like a brother, she meets them, like her brother, she meets them from the station in the carriage and accompanies them home. And I think that last point shows a real bond between the Peels and their children, because this absolutely isn't a necessary activity. It's just a really touching thing for either William or Margaret to do, to be there to greet their parents like that, to purposefully make that little trip in the carriage. And I think that's really nice that we actually have that, and that we can see that that was going on. It looks like Margaret was still living with her mother at Marble Hill after her father died, as I mentioned, and that she stayed there until Alice herself passed away in 1887. Margaret would then have had to move away because her parents' assets, including the house, were divided among all 7 of their children. The Illustrated London News reported specifically that Margaret received an annuity of £400 for life. It doesn't mention any of the other children, and that's likely because she hadn't needed a dowry from her parents upon marriage, and she didn't have a spouse or family to provide for her once her parents had died. We don't know where she moved to, and unfortunately I wasn't able to track down a death certificate for her, but we know from a monumental inscription that I've just put on screen there that she was buried near Ruislip. So yeah, we don't have the final details of the kind of last years of her life, but the overwhelming arc of her life we can still see, and that's really nice. In addition to the Peel family, there were numerous members of household staff living and working at Marble Hill. The earliest information we have on servants at the house dates from soon after the Peels moved into the property in the mid-1820s. It's also some of the darkest information we have, and it relates to a housemaid called Marianne Bell, who worked for the Peels in their first years together in Twickenham. After losing her position in 1828, Bell visited the expensive shop of Howell and James on Regent Street, a jewellers and silk merchants trading in high-quality goods. A system of credit existed at the time, where products could be acquired by giving the name of a known individual or customer to be paid for later. It was not uncommon for servants to make such purchases on behalf of their employers, and Marianne Bell took advantage of this. Giving the name of Alice Peel, her now ex-mistress, she procured over £70 worth of goods. At the time, that actually would have been equivalent to well over a year's wages for a housemaid like Marianne, so it was taken very seriously. She was caught, and we have a letter from Jonathan to his brother, requesting arrangements to make her imprisonment in Newgate Jail as painless as possible. We don't know why Marianne stopped working for the Peels, but Jonathan's letter to his brother describes her as formerly a very respectable person, so we can assume that this was the first time she had shown any hint of this kind of behaviour. Jonathan's plea worked, and Marianne was indeed moved to the penitentiary, but her final sentence was nonetheless harsh. In April 28, she was sentenced to transportation for 7 years, sent overseas to a penal colony, likely to Australia. Prosecutions for fraud were very harsh in this period. They took the intent of the criminal into consideration, giving out severe punishments for the deceit involved as much as for the theft of the goods themselves. From 1841, nationwide censuses were taken every 10 years, and those dating from the Peels' ownership of Marble Hill give a really useful insight into the house at these 10-year intervals. Yeah, that's really useful for looking at servants as well, and this first census is in a really bad way, so don't worry too much about being able to read it very well. But it does show the Peels with their 3 daughters and 4 foreign women. That's at the bottom left. You can see that column on the right, that shows 4 foreign women in a row. And the census is really handy for giving nationalities of servants. While all of these staff members are of English birth, those 4 foreign women were guests of the Peels. Later censuses actually show the range of nationalities among the Peels staff. You can see in the census returns here from 1871 and 1881 that Alice had French and Swiss ladies' maids, reflecting her entanglement and interest in French culture. You can also see that the family had live-in cooks from the continent, from France and Vienna, Austria. Jonathan too had European personal staff in the form of his gentleman's valet, Nicholas Beck. Beck is from France, and he's a really good find in the census because he crops up repeatedly in the Peels' letters from the 1850s. We can map him exactly onto this kind of more factual information. That's not the case for any of the other household staff, unfortunately. Beck's the only one who shows up. But as far as Beck is concerned, it is fantastic that we can see a bit more detail about his life and his activities and responsibilities at Marble Hill. As a gentleman's valet, Beck would have worked closely with Jonathan, much like a lady's maid would have done with Alice. For anyone who's seen Downton Abbey, this is kind of a useful reference point. Mr. Bates is the valet, so picture someone with his kind of responsibilities. Beck would have helped with anything from domestic tasks and errands to financial affairs like paying bills and handling money. The letters show Beck preparing Jonathan's clothing for dinners to places like Windsor Castle, helping him choose his outfits and pairing clothes together for travel, and we can see him helping him pack for longer stays away from home. Jonathan comments on Beck waiting for him when he returns late from Parliament or from a dinner, and he's often mentioned when Jonathan describes arrangements for various carriages to collect family members from the station following visits further afield. Beck actually crops up multiple times alongside a particularly valued member of the Peel household, and that's the family dog, known as the Pie or Pie, which is a great name and never fails to warm my little heart. That's lovely. Pie was one of the many animals living at Marble Hill, and he's probably the one I most wish we had a photograph of. He really shines out of the Peel's letters as this mischievous, lovable hound with a big personality. We don't have a photograph of him. The images that I've put on screen are just kind of suggestive. We don't know what kind of breed he was, but in looking into him, one of my colleagues wondered whether with a name like Pie, he might have had piebald colouring, so potentially he was black and white. In one of his letters, Jonathan discusses how Beck brushes the Pie every morning, so we can be pretty confident that he wasn't a short-haired breed. He paints this little picture of how the dog really hates being brushed and he runs off and hides, but eventually he comes back happily because he wants to see Beck. And when Beck is up waiting late at night to greet Jonathan, who's coming back to Marble Hill, Jonathan talks about how the dog always comes galloping out to him with Beck following in tow. So yeah, it really suggests that the two of them have been sitting together waiting for Jonathan. I think that's a really nice image of how involved Beck was in Jonathan's life as well, that he had a really close relationship with the family dog. It really helps us picture Marble Hill as this vibrant lived-in space with all of these kind of characters populating it. And there is so much affection in the way that Jonathan and the other family members talk about the dog. He mentions him in almost every letter to his wife, either sending his love to Pie or asking after him, or even when he's at Marble Hill while Alice is away in France, chiding her for not asking after the dog. You can see in that letter there, he says, the Pie sends you his love, but remarks that you have never inquired after him. And there's another letter where he says, tell the Pie I'm coming home on Monday and invite him to a very late dinner. He shall know what I mean. So this fun little third character between the couple always pops up in their letters. And he ends up having this whole really dynamic personality. It's really charming to read. There's another little story that I absolutely had to make sure I talked about regarding Pie because I just love it. And that's a letter describing an anonymous gift that was left for Jonathan at the War Office. It's a book and it's dedicated to the Secretary of State and his quarrelsome dog, full of pictures of a dog that looks just like Pie. The whole letter is Jonathan ruminating on who could have sent him the book and how it set the whole house thinking and trying to figure out who might have done it. And it's so clear that this dog just looms so large in the family's lives, and that was the case for their friends and acquaintances too. There are also a significant number of cows seemingly kept on site. There are 2 dairymaids in the census returns from 1861 and 1871, and there may have been additional workers. Mostly censuses only record people who were actually staying overnight at a property. So if people were living elsewhere and travelling into Marble Hill for work each day, they may not show up. The sales catalogue made upon Alice's death in 1887 shows a herd of 25 purebred Jersey cattle. And that's actually a Hereford cow. I couldn't find any 19th century pictures of Jerseys, but I really, really like how rectangular cows are in all of these paintings. So yeah, I really wanted to include one all the same. 7 years before, Alderney cows were sold from Marble Hill too. So the dairy may have been considerably larger before we get to see a proper snapshot of it in the sales catalogue made upon Alice's death. It might have been supplying produce for sale elsewhere, especially when we consider that in the 1880s, only Alice and Margaret were actually living at the house full time. There's only one little snapshot of the dairy in the letters, but it is a lovely one, and it's from Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, who I showed you before, who writes to Alice to say that she would love some of the family's beautiful cream cheese from the dairy, so they clearly had a bit of a reputation for producing good stuff. I've left till last the one very visible mark that the Peels left on Marble Hill, and which Rachel mentioned in the beginning. And yeah, it's something I suspect is very familiar with anyone who's been able to visit the site in person. And yeah, I may be a little bit biased, but they're I've never had a bad soup, but they're all fantastic. But anyway, that mark is the stables, and that is the only thing that we have left of any changes that the Peels made to the house. It was built by the Peels in 1825, just months after purchasing the house and grounds, and as I say, it's now the Marble Hill Cafe. The stable would have housed the Peels' horses, which would have drawn their broom carriage, looking somewhere between these two images. You can see that the carriage on the right is a bit more fancy, with 2 horses instead of 1. But however the carriage looked, it would have been quite luxurious inside, and unfortunately we just don't have the finer details. Jonathan never makes any clear reference to the stables themselves in his letters, but does repeatedly describe himself and his family members moving around London in the carriage. Rooms were fairly small and could mostly only accommodate 2 people, and Jonathan mentions it often in relation to Alice returning back from France or journeys further afield, offering to send their son William in the brougham or his valet Beck, or to come himself to meet Alice from the train at London Bridge Station. It's unclear whether the stables were ever used to house any of Jonathan's many racehorses. He was very keen on racehorsing, even if his relationship with it was at times tumultuous. In one of his letters, Jonathan laments that his horse ran shockingly at Newmarket, and he wants all of them sold immediately. He's done. But he did actually sell his entire stud in 1851, meaning a group of breeding horses here rather than one individual male horse. And he made over 10,000 guineas on the sales, equating to over 63,000 days' wages for a labouring tradesman. I know that's quite an unimaginable number, but just to kind of demonstrate how much money was invested in the horses that he owned at this period. The auctions took place elsewhere, but advertisements for the horses mentioned that they could be viewed by applying to a Mr. Moore at the Marble Hill stables, so it's unclear whether any of the horses were actually being housed there at the time. The most famous of Peel's horses was the Derby winner Orlando, who sold for over 3,100 guineas alone. That's him in the picture on the top left there. Marble Hill did have pictures of Jonathan's favourite horses inside it at Alice's death too. That's another snapshot from the sales catalogue at the bottom left. We don't know what horse is being referenced by the name favourite racehorse, but there is clearly an oil painting of a horse in the house, and probably a hunter as well is another racehorse. For people moving in the elite social circles of the kind Jonathan moved in during the 19th century, among conservative politicians and members of the landed gentry, racehorses were a fairly common pastime. For Jonathan, the grand stables would have been an important investment at the house, and it makes sense that this emblem of identity and social status is the element of the Peel's Marble Hill that still survives today. Okay, so that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the Peel family. Jonathan, a man from a famous political family with his own involvement in the British politics of his time, high up in his party and well established in his connections with the Queen. Alice, a woman with family ties to Twickenham and political and social connections of her own, spanning Europe and particularly centering on France. Their daughter, Margaret, a previously unrecognised key member of the household at Marble Hill, living her own life from the house as well as assisting her parents with the management of the home. And management which fell on many of the servants and household staff that I've mentioned, like Beck and Marianne Bell, who passed through the doors of Marble Hill over the years. It was a family home, as well as a hub for the family's many friends and political acquaintances, alive with social gatherings, teas and dinners, with their dog, the Pie, boisterously roving through the scene. Alice Peel lived at Marble Hill longer than any other inhabitant in its history. For a family who owned the house for over 60 years, very little has previously been known about the Peels and their time there. They're a fascinating insight into the character of the home and another notch in its incredible story, and there's so much more still to find out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leonie. I think you've given us a really fantastic view of the family life of Marble Hill, but also kind of sharing about the Peel family and actually their fingerprint that they put on this fantastic place. So thank you for enriching our understanding of that so generously. It's like the relationship between the Peel pair is quite progressive, isn't it, in terms of Alice having her own relations independently of her husband. Was this something that was happening in the time?
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. It's so interesting that her close friend is Dorothea Leven, who we see separating from her husband, actually, so that she can kind of pursue that independently of him. In writing about her, she's often spoken about as someone who eclipsed her husband. He was an ambassador, but she was like the real ambassador in the couple. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that Alice is having those kind of political connections. And there were certainly societies in London for women where women would have had their political interests and been able to talk about them together in a kind of homosocial space where it was just women. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting kind of time for women to be exercising their views that way, because Alice has no kind of formal outlet for her political interests and power and that kind of thing, but she's still clearly kind of pulling strings and putting people together at the dinner table to kind of get the outcome that she wants. So yeah, it's really, really interesting.
She's sort of working behind the scenes, and also sounds like she's a little bit at odds with her husband in some respect.
Yeah, potentially. That relationship with Bright is really, really interesting. We don't know how far she agreed with all of the things that Bright stood for. He was quite outspoken, and as I say, he was in opposition with Jonathan. They were members of different parties, but she's using Bright to some degree as kind of this vehicle. Also believes in the French side of things to promote her kind of French interests. So yeah, I'd really like to know a little bit more about kind of why she kind of nurtures that relationship, what Bright was showing prior to their relationship that made her say like, oh yeah, I want to be friends with John Bright. He can get me kind of what I want. Like, he's a useful person to bring to the table. Yeah.
The people listening to the talk has mentioned about those letters. Where did you get the letters from? Because there was that lovely slide with lots of different letters on it, and just where did you start with your research?
Yeah, so there are so many letters, actually. It's just a shame that we don't have any that Alice has written herself. There are only 2 existing that Alice has written, and those are the ones to Bright. But the rest of the letters are all in Balliol College at Oxford, and anyone can apply to go and have a look at them. There is a big collection there called the Maurier collection, and that's actually one of Alice's daughters married a French diplomat, an Anglo-French diplomat called Robert Maurier. And that's like another string to the bow of the family's kind of French connections. Maurier often gets brought up at the dinner table. He's this really key figure, this really key go-between in all of the politics that Alice is interested in. And he was an alumnus of Balliol College, so it's thanks to him. And I think that they're predominantly Alice's collection, their letters that were sent to her. So that's why we have Jonathan and all of her friends. And it's through her daughter and her daughter's husband that we still have them today. So yeah, it's a fantastic collection, and some of them are available online as well. If you want to have a look at them, you totally can. There are letters that Jonathan has received from Victoria. Just have a look at Peel letters. The Maurier collection, that's Morier. And yeah, they're available on Flickr. Balliol have digitized some of them, and there's a wealth of stuff there. It's great.
Fantastic. I mean, it's quite interesting to see the script. It does look a little bit of a challenge to kind of decipher, especially when you showed us the letter of the kind of writing one way and then turning it 19 degrees and then writing it another way. Was this a normal common function of the time, or was this specifically for the Peels?
Yeah, so I never come across it before, but I do work predominantly on the 18th century, so this was a little bit of a new area for me. And yeah, I showed it to my supervisor for the project, Megan Leyland, and she was like, oh yeah, this happens a fair bit. You're lucky that you've never seen it before, kind of thing. Because yeah, it's really hard to deal with. It's hard enough to read just the one line that Jonathan's writing, let alone when he's turning it around and writing over it again. But as I say, it is doable, and once you've got your eye in, yeah, his writing does kind of open itself up a little bit to be read.
Great to be able to actually physically see that script, and congratulations in your ability to decipher it. I think we're all pretty impressed by that. The next question I've got from the team here is around the servants, and it was great to be able to hear about Beck and kind of the various different places that the servants would have come from. Do you know where the live-in servants actually lived?
We don't know tons about them. There are quarters right in the ceiling of the house that look as though they may have been servants' rooms. But as I say, we don't really have that much left physically of the Peels at Marble Hill. The stables is pretty much all that we have that's absolutely definite about what they were doing. I wasn't able to track down any other kind of mentions of how they were using space or that kind of thing, but I do think the servants would potentially have been spread between the upstairs and the downstairs, like right at the top of the house in the eaves. The rooms are, they're quite like bare, but yeah, they were very warm when I went in summer, so yeah, hopefully it would have still been kind of livable quarters for everyone.
So another question is around the 60 years. So it's quite interesting that you're suggesting that they were potentially going to sell it, but kind of in that time, they didn't add anything to the house, or in terms of buildings, bar the stables.
Yeah, we have. So some of the letters talk about them reworking their other house at Park Place, and Jonathan's really angry because they want to make an extension, but the council are also expanding the road at the same time, and that's the very spot that they want to put their new living room. So he's really annoyed that he's like, oh, why do they have to build the road now? I don't want like carriages going right past the window and that kind of thing. But there's nothing of that sort in reference to Marble Hill that I've come across thus far, unfortunately. Yeah, I do think they made some changes to the wing. If you're looking at the house, the left wing of the house, there was like a service wing originally there. But yeah, I'm not sure of the kind of concrete what that actually looked like.
And I think someone's also mentioned about Marianne Bell, and that's that kind of quite sad story.
So Marianne Bell was, yeah, really interesting to look into. There was a mention of her in the Oxford Handbook of the History of Crime, actually. That was how I found her, and doing some other research on Marble Hill, that kind of cropped up in my searches. And then I followed her through all of the Find My Past documents. So they're documents where like censuses and different kinds of Home Office records, prison registers, all those kind of things are available through Find My Past. If you have membership or go into a public library, you can get them there. Yeah, and there was this incredible paper trail leading to Marianne Bell. She crops up in all the prison registers. You can see her in the prison, you can see her moving to the penitentiary, all those different things. And that letter that Jonathan wrote to his brother trying to get her moved, and successful in doing so. There's another letter that I didn't actually include, and that's really sad as well. It's her mother, Marianne Bell's mother, appealing to the justice, saying, she's like, my daughter's pregnant and you're going to send her abroad, can you please like delay until she has her baby? And we don't know the outcome of that, unfortunately, but yeah, all of it's yeah, it's a really tough story, isn't it? And interesting as well that the Peels are kind of appealing on her behalf. I don't know to what extent they were thinking that, oh, we need to kind of show that we have a fairly upstanding servant either way, but it's quite a personal thing, so I don't think that's necessarily the case. It seems more of a personal investment in her.
It certainly caught the hearts and minds and imagination of the audience, but also that of the pie. It sounds like a wonderful companion to the family, but do we know where the origins of the pie name has come from?
Oh, I have no idea. When I first read it, I thought about him as this little like steak and ale thing dashing around. But no, I think the suggestion that one of my colleagues made, that it might stand for piebald, is yeah, potentially a really strong one. I love it as well. He crops up sometimes as Sir Pie and Dr. Pie. It's just, yeah, it really seems like a symbol of the affection that they had for him, that he's got this lovely little enigmatic nickname. But no, we're not 100% sure where it came from. I'd love to see a picture of him. Yeah, I only hope that sometime some photographs are uncovered of Marble Hill during this period. But
well, I just love the name. It sounds rather sweet, although kind of a bit alarming that they might use him in a pie. I think was the concern by one of our audience. Do you know where the Peels were when they rented out their house? Do we know?
I think for some periods they were at Park Place, their other house in central London. But I think it's on Alice's side or one of Jonathan's siblings potentially that they're staying with in Kemp Town in Brighton sometimes as well, which was a really fashionable resort to be at. And certainly when Jonathan is ill in later life, they return there. He seems to go there to kind of recuperate and stuff. So it's unclear whether that's where they were spending time, but they did have kind of other properties that they were spending time at, so potentially that's where they were at the time. Yeah, but none of the envelopes from those periods kind of give us that much of a clue.
Fingers crossed, if anybody knows anything more, you can always get in touch with Leonie. And the last question we wanted to finish with, understanding that there's this fantastic story of the Peels, their family life, and also kind of Henrietta, and kind of the ongoing history of a place like Marble Hill, which is obviously having a really big revival. What's the story that has really sung to you in terms of either the Peels or Henrietta or the Cunards or all of the or maybe today? What has floated your boat as being part of the Revive project?
There's so much about it. I think there are so many comparisons to be made between Alice as someone who is bringing together this really interesting circle in the same way that kind of Henrietta is, and that's really brought out at the house in the way that it's been represented now, but also just in the family life. The fact that Margaret was living there really resonated, that we didn't know about this woman's life before, but she's kind of come out to us through the letters. I think just that the house was this really like vital place actually that people were living in. It's not just kind of a shell as we might think of it, like a museum or whatever. It was actually like a really a living space that people were populating. And yeah, that domestic side of things is really what I've loved uncovering.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this fantastic story with so much generosity. It's been lovely to have such a lovely audience who have really engaged with the stories. And we really can't wait for Marble Hill to be really a living space when we reopen in the spring. But thank you so much for being such an important part of the interpretation that will be happening as part of the cafe, but also kind of part of the Revive project, because it's been great to be a small part of your PhD, and we can't wait to celebrate when you get your doctorate. And we just wish you all the very, very best, Leonie, and just thank you so much for tonight. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, and it's lovely to be able to share about these stories. You are very welcome to view any of the events that we've had as part of our project on the Marble Hill YouTube channel. And of course, there's an opportunity to become a member of English Heritage, as it's the best way to be able to give back to the charity that is the custodian of Marble Hill, both the house and the 66-acre park. So please do think about that if you have an opportunity. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Leonie, and it's lovely to be with you. Good night, everyone.